Hello everybody and welcome back, and today I've got an episode that is going to cover the topic of how do you play Russian destroyers. And it's something that I've seen where people have asked, how do you play things like the Tashkent, which is not an easy ship to play. And so I figured that I should probably do some sort of overarching Russian destroyer gameplay advice video. And of course, I got this replay, which is a Khabarovsk replay that is the second highest Khabarovsk damage on the NA server. This replay is from Destroyer Hatsuyuki, hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly, and it pretty much will define Russian destroyer play. I think the exceptions might be the lower tier ships, which don't have the use of their torpedoes as much. However, if you're playing things like the Tashkent with the fully upgraded torpedoes, the Udaloy, and the Khabarovsk, then you can pretty much use everything in this replay as a guide on what you're supposed to do. Now, before I actually start, there is just one other thing. The last time I posted a video and I went through one of the comments, I got one like this. And so, Natalie and Nicholas, who are twins, I wish you two a very, very happy 12th birthday. I hope you had a fantastic time. Alright, so let's move on to this actual replay. So take a look at the positioning of Russian destroyers, and that is actually something that's going to be very, very important when you play them. Russian destroyers, unlike certain other destroyers, namely the US ones and the Japanese ones, are not really frontline ships. They're second line support vessels. So that means that in a lot of cases, what you want to have is stealthier destroyers, American, Japanese destroyers, to go in front of you. You want maybe even cruisers to go in front of you. And what you want to do is sort of hang around that middle area between where the cruisers are and where your battleships are, and even maybe sometimes behind the battleships, depending on where the battleships have pushed to. And your purpose is primarily to sort of weave in and out and throw lots and lots of shells at enemy ships. If you run into ships that are heavily armored and are angled, you want to spam, of course, lots of HE. If you do get broadside shots pretty consistently, you might also want to switch to armor piercing. The Russian destroyers are not like American destroyers in the way that their arcs are relatively flat. So while American destroyers are quite good at hiding behind islands and throwing shells over it, Russian destroyers aren't that great at sort of hiding behind islands. However, if you sit a little bit further back, you can still accomplish a certain degree of lobbing your shells over islands, and the islands will provide a certain degree of cover. Still, the primary defense for Russian destroyers is really their high speed and the fact that they're not exactly the easiest targets to hit. So instead of adopting the US end playstyle, which is hiding behind islands and lobbing shells over, with the Russian destroyers, you're really just weaving a lot in, out, making yourself a very, very difficult target to hit. And at the same time, especially when you're weaving in and out among larger ships, you are going to make it so that the enemy doesn't really focus on you, because you're not exactly the easiest target to hit. So enemies will generally target things that are bigger, a little bit less maneuverable. They'll go for that. And so by weaving in and out of your large ships, you're able to stay relatively close to the front lines where the action is, at the same time having that high speed making you a very difficult target, and then also making it so that on the enemy's list of priorities, you're not really all that high up. Furthermore, being a destroyer amongst your own fleet also does allow you to provide a certain degree of protection. In case things start to go a little bit wrong, you're able to immediately go over and start using smoke to provide cover, and thereby swing that advantage towards your own team again. So if you take a look at what Hatsuyuki is doing right now, you'll see that it pretty much is sticking with that force of battleships and basically not really being the main target. You'll see that the enemy battleships are more concerned with the battleships that are rushing them down and the cruisers, and the destroyer can just sit there and continuously set fires. Just continue to aggravate, shall we say, the enemy battleship and cruiser players. You just constantly rain down HE, you destroy their secondary mounts, you knock out anti-aircraft guns, and you just constantly prevent them from being able to get rid of their damage over time. Especially when battleships are in brawling range with each other, they are going to be setting fires to each other as well. So if they do put it out with damage control party, you just set them right on fire again. Then of course you can get quite a bit of fire damage. And as you can tell, that Montana just really didn't stand a chance against all these ships. Even though the Montana was stopped and angled, there was just too much. It was an overwhelming amount of concentrated HE and fire damage that the Montana just could not recover from that. So now that the battleship is done, take a look again at the positioning of Hatsuyuki's Khabarovsk. A little bit further back now, letting the battleships and letting the cruisers take the lead while sitting back and continuing to pummel the enemy team with high explosive. One thing to keep in mind when you're playing a gunboat, and well, two things I guess that is important to keep in mind when you're playing a gunboat, is don't tunnel vision, right? There's a lot of times I've seen people and they're so focused on shooting at one target, they sort of kind of ignore other things that are happening around them. With a gunboat, truthfully, when you're shooting at battleships, you're not really doing all that much damage with HE. So what you really are getting damage from is stacking things like fire and flooding. So what you're going to do is fire at one ship, set it on fire once or twice, then transition to a different target, then shoot at that different target. So you'll see that Hatsuyuki does this. Fires at one battleship, gets fires. Switches over to another battleship, tries to get fires. Once that battleship is lit, transition to a different target. And what this allows you to do is you're able to constantly maintain damage over time on enemy ships. And so if you're constantly able to do that, enemy ships, they sort of lose that desire to push. Okay, there we go. Yamato's on fire, switches over to the Iowa. And that's a very, very smart thing to do, because now the Yamato has to decide, do I want to put out this fire? And if the Yamato puts out a fire, then immediately, of course, you want to light them on fire again, because that will allow you to basically get a full X amount of seconds worth of fire damage. So that is something you want to keep in mind. 1.5 point, because it's sort of related to fire damage, is keep a very active eye on the usage of damage control parties. See when you've got something on fire. See when that ship puts it out, and make sure to start lighting them on fire right away again. Well, Hatsuyuki does run into a bit of a problem here as his team sort of just melts. The battleships that were in front melted, and well, just if you look at the two other battleships, they're really, really far back and they're sniping, and that means he's sort of on the front lines by himself, but again, using great Russian destroyer agility, is able to keep himself out of trouble to a certain degree. Again, don't forget to also use AP when ships are giving you that broadside, as you are able to get a decent amount of damage from that. And already there's the Witherer badge, so that's already 60,000 in flooding and fire damage. Gets a torpedo hit on something, so that is definitely going to cause flooding as well. Okay, moving on to point 2. One really important thing when you're playing a gunboat is you're pretty much going to be constantly shooting. Never stop shooting, unless of course you're in a horrible situation where you have to use stealth to get away. Other than that, you're pretty much constantly going to be spamming your guns at something. Whatever is a viable target in range, you're going to be spamming shots at them. That Yamato, see it? The number of times that Yamato's been on fire. It really, if you're playing a battleship and you're constantly being shelled by something, it really takes that it takes that drive to push out of you as a battleship player, and that's sort of, it's a bit psychological. You're getting a little bit shell-shocked in a way. The other thing, of course, is that destroyers, especially these really fast Russian destroyers, if you stay outside at range and you're slinging HE at range, it is an incredibly frustrating target to shoot at for battleships, because you have this very, very small target, or in the Khabarovsk case, not that small, but you have this reasonably small target that is really, really fast. And so trying to hit them is not easy. The amount of lead you have to give is quite substantial. Never mind the fact that they also have smoke, and they can still, of course, pop smoke, sit in it, and spam you with more shots. So these kinds of ships, if they stay at a range they're comfortable with, so for example, in the Khabarovsk case, like 12, 13 kilometers, it's a very comfortable range for Khabarovsk. Not a super comfortable range to hit it in return if you're in a battleship, if the destroyer is actually actively evading, constantly weaving in and out. And that's another thing. If you're going to excel in Russian destroyers, you have to be able to continuously weave in and out. With the Khabarovsk, Udaloy, the ships with the longer range torpedoes, don't forget to use them. So when they're reloaded and you have a good place to use them, use them. Get those torpedoes out and then go back to being a gunboat again. The torpedoes, they're not going to be like Shimakaze torpedoes. You're not going to be getting massive hits or, with the salvo. You're going to get maybe one hit. But what you're really going for is flooding. You want to flood that enemy ship and then, of course, force the enemy battleship to burn the damage control party. And, of course, once the damage control party is burned, go right back to HE, set them on fire, and that is guaranteed damage. And so those are things to really, really keep in mind when you're playing these Russian destroyers. Dealing with the lower tier ones, so if you're playing things like the Kiev and the things like the Ognivoy, the ones with the really short range torpedoes, like, yes, I can see that there's going to be some pain there. That's for sure. And I guess my recommendation for those ships is you have to be very situationally aware as well. Like, find places where you can lay an ambush, predict the movements of enemy ships. Again, you do have to maintain that solid sense, but always remember that your main weapons are your guns, and you really, really should be shooting. So what about some people who obviously bring up this situation? It's like, okay, well, what if I'm the only destroyer and I'm being forced to cap? Then what? Well, you are put in a very difficult situation in that regard. You're going to be spotted by the enemy destroyer first, but then again, remember you do have great speed, so go to places where the enemy destroyer isn't, and then go and deal with things like cap and whatnot. You're still stealthier than all the cruisers out there. So the best way to sort of conceptualize what the Russian destroyers are is that they are basically light cruisers without citadels, and you have to play them in much the same way you will play cruisers, not so much the way you will play destroyers. So in the traditional sense that people consider destroyer play to be something you go actively running to every cap as quickly as you can, contest that cap against enemy ships, and do things like that, the Russian destroyers, not really. They're in that sort of second line role where they offer support to whichever sort of ship needs it more, whether that be destroyers, cruisers, or battleships, and they can use their high speed to rotate between different positions to help their team with various tasks, whether that be capping or holding pushes or pushing, and applying damage over time to whatever ship lies in your path. So Hatsuyuki, as you can tell in this battle, has really been doing a very good job there. Also, by the way, if you run into broadside battleships and they're not on fire, you could also consider setting them on fire first before switching over to armor piercing. One thing about armor piercing, though, if you're going to fire at a battleship and it's not that broadside to you anymore, you could still try hitting superstructure with it. Battleship superstructure, especially things like the Iowa or the Yamato, where they have these sort of big superstructures, you could try to hit them there, and they will do some pretty decent damage. Although, generally speaking, I still obviously prefer HE, as I think it's just more annoying. To get shot by something you can't really shoot back at, or is invisible a lot of times in a battleship, and that's constantly setting you on fire, that's something that's really, really annoying. Still, if you do catch broadsides, as you can tell, those salvos, because they come out so quickly, they do hurt, as some of them are able to do 2,000 plus damage per salvo, and that hurts because they're coming so much quicker. So the DPM is also going to play a role when you play a gunboat. Okay, so this battle with Hatsuyuki is pretty much coming to a close. There is going to be one more ship that Hatsuyuki is going to be able to sink, and that is the enemy Essex, which has wandered, within 12 kilometers of Khabarovsk. Yeah, it's not a good place to be if you're in a carrier, by the way. Typically speaking, what you want to do if you are in a destroyer, a Russian destroyer, and you get close to a carrier, HE first, set fires, make sure that the carrier cannot really launch planes against you. And then, after the carrier, in this particular case, has burned the damage control party, you obviously want to continue using HE to set another fire, and then you want to move over to AP and then go for either citadel hits or just good damage penetrating hits when the carrier gives you a broadside. One thing to keep in mind, certain carriers do have reasonably strong secondaries. So you might want to just stay a little bit outside their secondary range so you're not having to deal with secondary fire. In this case, Hatsuyuki doesn't really have a choice. They've got basically this Essex in front of them. There's like a cruiser to one side. Not really a thing you want to be staying out in the open. So I can see why Hatsuyuki decided to take cover here behind this one island. Is going to get the Essex kill, by the way. But once the Essex gets taken down, Hatsuyuki runs out of support from his own team, and that pretty much is the end of his battle, basically. The two cruisers are going to close him down. There's still a Des Moines, which is a very, very dangerous ship. And, of course, there is also a Mogami, which is not a very good ship you want to face off against in a low HP destroyer. And sort of the two combined together, the Mogami and the Des Moines, are going to trap Hatsuyuki in this little spot and is going to kill him. Of course, having CV aircraft nearby is also a pain, as you couldn't use stealth to slip away. Mogami's going to get those last kills, the last shots in there, and Hatsuyuki is going to die. So after all that effort, is still going to lose this battle. So let's take a look at the end results screen, and I'll sort of go over sort of a rehash of the main points that I made in this video. So Hatsuyuki manages 299,822 damage, almost 300k damage. High caliber, Witherer, Confederate. Look at the number of hits of the main gun, 625. Only 3 torpedo hits, but take a look at, of course, then fire and flooding. 3 floodings, 27 fires. That's the thing about Russian destroyers. You have to keep firing those guns. Torpedoes, yes, they have a use, but primarily it's guns. So if you're playing things like an Udaloy, Khabarovsk, or a fully upgraded Tashkent, yes, you can use your torpedoes, don't forget about them, but still make sure you keep firing the guns. You want to collect as many hits and as many fires as you possibly can during a typical battle. Take a look at this screen, which is really, really interesting. If you take a look, Hatsuyuki fired somewhere in the range of 1,200 and I think 80 shells in this battle. So that's a tremendous amount of shells fired. Take a look at HE damage, 98,000, so almost 100k damage there. Armor piercing was 53,000 damage though. Take a look at the fires, 112k fire damage. So that's pretty incredible. Remember, as the Russian destroyers, to sort of stay with your fleet and harass the enemy team. Be an ultimate pest and really piss them off with your fires, basically. Also remember to stay evasive all the time. Wiggle, weave, dodge, whatever is possible to keep yourself a difficult target to hit so people won't focus you down. And of course, if you do all this right, you will be rewarded. Even on the losing team, Hatsuyuki has 2,347 base experience, the top of anybody in this match. Anyways, folks, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions about Russian destroyer gameplays, please leave those in the comment section below. Aside from all that, I hope you have a good one. Take care, and I'll talk to all of you again soon.